It all started on what should have been an ordinary Saturday morning. My wife and I were outside, enjoying the sunshine, when the peace of our day was suddenly interrupted by our neighbor, the one we've come to know as the HOA's self-appointed enforcer. You probably know the type, the kind of person who believes every little thing is a violation, even when it's not. She stormed out, glaring across the street, her phone already in her hand. Within seconds, she was shouting accusations that left us stunned. She claimed my wife had been outside waving a gun around, something so far from reality it felt like a bad joke. We thought it was just another empty threat, another attempt to intimidate us into silence. But not long after, we heard sirens. Police cars rolled into the neighborhood, lights flashing, and suddenly everything became very real. My wife stood frozen, confused and nervous, while I tried to process how a simple morning in our yard had turned into a scene straight out of a drama. What made it even worse was how quickly the situation escalated. In less than a minute, the story our neighbor told had completely unraveled, and the officers started seeing the truth for themselves. But before we could even catch our breath, the day took a shocking turn that nobody on our street saw coming. Because instead of walking away, the police walked straight toward our neighbor. And what happened next changed the neighborhood dynamic forever. This is the story of how an HOA Karen's false call backfired in the most unexpected way. To really understand how everything spiraled that day, you need to know a little about our history with her. From the moment we moved in, she seemed determined to make us her personal project. If my grass grew an inch too tall, she sent a complaint. If a delivery truck stayed in front of our house for more than 5 minutes, she'd snap photos like she was collecting evidence. The HOA board never seemed to question her reports either. It was as if she thrived on stirring up trouble and keeping everyone on edge. Still, no matter how unreasonable she was, we never imagined she'd go so far as to make a call like this. My wife had only been outside tending to the garden, gloves still on her hands, watering the flowers by the fence. That was it. Yet somehow, in her eyes, it became a scene worth dialing 911 over. Looking back, it feels like she had been waiting for the perfect chance to make a move that would finally get us out of her way. When the officers pulled up, neighbors started peeking through curtains and stepping out onto their porches.
You could
feel the tension spreading down the street, whispers carrying from one house to the next. Some folks knew her reputation, others weren't sure what to believe, but all of them were watching closely. And in that moment, the lines between truth and accusation blurred. We didn't yet know how far she had pushed her lie, or how the police were about to uncover details that she probably wished had stayed hidden. But the way they shifted their attention told us something big was coming. The officers began asking questions, their radios crackling as they moved back and forth between us and her. My wife tried to stay calm, explaining exactly what she had been doing, pointing to the garden tools still lying in the dirt. The garden hose was still dripping water, proof of what she'd been up to. But across the street, our neighbor was standing tall with her arms folded, acting as if she had just uncovered the crime of the century. She waved her phone in the air, insisting she had seen everything and that the neighborhood wasn't safe with us living here. What made it stranger was how quickly she shifted her story. When the officers pressed for details, first, she said, "My wife had been waving something shiny." Then, when asked to describe it, she fumbled and changed her words, calling it a black object. It was clear to anyone listening that her tale wasn't adding up, but she doubled down, trying to spin the story louder and faster than it could unravel. Meanwhile, a few of the neighbors who had grown tired of her antics started murmuring to each other. One even spoke up, telling the officers about the countless times she had filed false complaints, everything from barking dogs that didn't exist to unapproved decorations during the holidays. Her reputation was catching up to her, and You could feel the tide beginning to turn, but even as the truth slowly came into focus, we couldn't relax. The officers hadn't made their move yet, and the air was heavy with uncertainty. My wife's hands shook at her sides, and I kept wondering just how far our neighbor was willing to push this lie to get what she wanted. Something about the way she smirked told me we weren't at the end of it yet. The more questions the officers asked, the more cracks began to show in her story. She raised her voice, trying to cover her uncertainty with confidence, but her words kept slipping. At one point, she insisted my wife had pointed the weapon at her, yet she couldn't say which hand it was in. When pressed further, she claimed she had photos scrolling frantically through her phone, but came up with nothing. The silence that followed was louder than any excuse she could have made. By then, nearly the entire block was watching. Some neighbors leaned against their fences. Others stood at the edge of their driveways, waiting to see what would happen next. You could feel the tension buzzing through the air like static. It wasn't just about us anymore. It felt like years of frustration with her behavior were about to boil over. People whispered things like, "She's gone too far this time," while others shook their heads in disbelief. I noticed one of the officers quietly stepping away, speaking into his radio, while another stayed near my wife, keeping her calm. My heart was pounding because although the truth seemed obvious to us, I knew how quickly situations like this could spiral. All it would take was one wrong assumption for everything to go sideways. Across the street, she stood with that same smug expression, convinced she was untouchable. She kept insisting she was protecting the neighborhood, acting like some self-appointed hero. But the way the officers exchanged glances, it was clear something had shifted. They weren't buying her story anymore. And in that moment, I realized we were standing right on the edge of a turning point, seconds away from the truth finally breaking through. Just when it seemed like the officers were about to call her out on her false report, she suddenly pulled out another claim from thin air. She pointed at me this time, saying I had been hiding something inside the garage, that we were stockpiling dangerous items. The words hit like a punch, and for a split second, the entire crowd went silent. Even the officers paused, exchanging uneasy glances as if they weren't sure what to make of it. I felt my stomach twist. It was one thing to drag my wife into this with her wild story, but now she was dragging me in too, trying to make us both look guilty. Neighbors muttered in disbelief, a few shaking their heads as if they couldn't believe how far she was willing to go. But the officers couldn't just ignore her words. One of them stepped toward the garage, asking me calmly if I minded opening it up. My chest tightened, because while I had nothing illegal inside, I knew the second I opened that door, all eyes in the neighborhood would be on me. My wife looked at me with worry, her hands still trembling from everything she'd just gone through. I nodded, trying to stay calm, but the tension in the air was unbearable. She wasn't backing down, in fact. She looked almost satisfied, like she thought she'd found a new way to trap us. The officers stood waiting, neighbors whispering, and the moment stretched longer than it should have. Everyone was on edge, not knowing what would happen when that garage door finally rolled up. And in that charged silence, the stakes suddenly felt higher than ever. The garage door creaked open, and all eyes locked on the space inside. Rows of shelves stacked with boxes, gardening supplies, and tools came into view. Nothing suspicious. Nothing suspicious. The officers stepped forward, scanning carefully, their flashlights cutting across the corners as the crowd leaned closer. My pulse hammered in my ears, but deep down I knew there was nothing for them to find. Within seconds, the truth was clear. Her accusation had completely fallen apart. One officer turned back to her, his expression sharp now, no longer patient. He asked again if she had any proof, any evidence at all. She stammered, her arms flailing, as she tried to string together another excuse. But then, in her panic, she slipped. She admitted she hadn't actually seen my wife with a gun, only that she assumed it was one. The words dropped heavy in the air, and the entire crowd erupted in gasps and whispers. It was over. She had cornered herself. That's when the twist came. The officer who had been quietly speaking into his radio earlier stepped forward with an update. This wasn't the first time she had made a false report. In fact, she had a record of wasting police resources in another county before moving here. Suddenly, everything snapped into focus. Her smug smile vanished as the officers turned on her. The cuffs clicked around her wrists, and for the first time since we'd moved in, the neighborhood felt united. The woman who had spent years trying to intimidate and control everyone was now the one being led away. And though relief washed over us, it was still shock in the air because nobody expected the HOA's loudest voice to be silenced in such a dramatic way. After the squad car pulled away, the street fell quiet in a way it hadn't been in years. Neighbors who had once kept their distance started walking over, some offering kind words to my wife, others shaking their heads at how far things had gone. It felt like a weight had been lifted, not just from us, but from the entire block. For the first time, people were openly sharing their own stories of how she had targeted them petty complaints. Late-night notes on doors, even threats about HOA fines that were never real. Suddenly, it wasn't just our problem anymore. It was something everyone had been living with. The HOA board, who had once taken her word without question, now had no choice but to confront the truth. They called an emergency meeting a week later, and the mood in that room was very different. Without her constant interference, neighbors finally had space to talk about real issues instead of invented ones. The board promised change, and for once people believed it at home. My wife and I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. What started as a normal morning had nearly turned our lives upside down, but in the end, it revealed just how much damage one person's lies can cause, how quickly the truth can set things right. Looking back, the biggest lesson was clear. Standing firm, even when you're being unfairly accused, matters. Because sometimes the louder someone yells, the more they reveal about themselves. And in our case, the person trying hardest to control the neighborhood was the one who lost all control in the end.